My name is Jeremy Gault. I'm the Director of the Coastal Marine Research Centre in University College Cork. I have a confession. I used to be an engineer, but I'm sort of over it now. I've sort of gone a bit liberal in my attitude, as you'll probably see as I talk today. I also need to apologise. I'm actually, though I do live in Cork, I obviously am from Northern Ireland, so if you want the English, it's on Channel 1 in the translation, so you do your best. I'd like to thank my colleague Anne-Marie O'Hagan, who can't be here today. She's in Washington, preaching over there, so I'm going to preach to you here and see how we get on. What I'm going to talk about today is Coexist, which is actually an aquaculture project in essence, but it's looking at aquaculture in the context of other users. And one of the other interesting things when we went to look at this project was how they perceived other industries. In my case, we were brought in to look specifically at governance. So what we did, we worked with the other partners. There are partners from across the European region. The vast majority of those tend to be aquacultural centres. We're the only centre within this who are not really aquaculture. We have an aquacultural partner, the FDC, in University College Cork. What we were looking at was essentially the governance mechanisms, how things were controlled in their area, what the stakeholders within the various fisheries and aquaculture and other environmental NGOs, local politicians, thought of aquaculture, fisheries, and the spatial demands in their particular area and interactions. As was sort of common most European projects, there are case study sites. So we went to these case study sites, we did a questionnaire, and we asked the people what they felt their views were. It's not surprising when you do a sort of a spatial questionnaire that you find that there are conflict, and across virtually all areas there was conflict. What was interesting to us was, the reasons for the conflict. There's aquaculture, there's intra-aquacultural disputes between different types of aquaculture, even same types of aquaculture for the same space. But when we came across as well, what we thought was interesting was they also started to point out that new industries, in their view, new industries, which was things like offshore energy. In some of the areas, especially in the sort of North Sea, they've quite established offshore wind, for example. They don't have wave technology as we do, or we're moving towards in Ireland. So it was interesting that they saw there was a perceived difficulty, not just with the structure, but also with the sort of cabling back to the shore as well. From our perspective, it was interesting that their solution seemed to be ICZM, which we thought had its day, and maritime spatial planning, which is the new white knight, the panacea for all things marine, will solve everything. So that was interesting to look at this here, and this was repeated across the different areas, and again, the sort of replication, the sort of idea that energy was the problem and that marine spatial planning was the thing that would fix that. My view is that maybe that isn't probably the case, and I'll come back to that. So what you have is renewable energy, and I think John talked about this previously from HMRC, was is this sort of a fear of the unknown? We're not really sure. There are definitely going to be impacts, but they're going to be positive as well as negative impacts. There's potential for synergy, and that hasn't really been investigated. We don't really know the situation now, especially with the newer wave technology. Maybe it's slightly easier with the offshore wind, but we don't really know yet what exactly is going to happen. We have lots of EU policy drivers. We're now meant to be getting economic benefit from a marine environment. So we've come up with all these things that we're working forward. We've controlling environmental mechanisms like the Water Framework Directive, the Floods Directive, etc. And then we've lots of cross-cutting policies built into that as well. What I'm going to concentrate today is probably on just three things and touch briefly upon these: ICZM and the recommendation, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and the proposed now EU Marine Spatial Planning and ICM Directive. Lots of acronyms. I have no graphs. I have lots of acronyms. That's my thing. So the important thing here is when you look at the terminology, recommendation, for want of a better word, is advisory, whereas directive is compulsory. So the EU ICZ recommendation was advisory, so some countries took it on board, some didn't take it on board. Directives you have to take on board, or extensively you get fined. So we have definitions. We've been doing integrated coastal management. As I said, we've been doing this in the CMRC since the sort of mid-90s, nearly 20 years now. We've definitions. We have sort of consensus of what the definition of integrated coastal management should be. And we have principles. Everything is principles. So after a large demonstration project in the 1990s, which UCC or CMRC was involved with, 35 sites across Europe, we came up with these 8 principles. And what's interesting in the principles is they're quite often very much common sense, but some of them are very difficult to put into operation. There's a problem that there's been in implementing ICZM, and that's why it's quite difficult to show examples where ICZM has actually achieved or been delivered. And some of the problems that have been put in are the sort of differences between scales, and time scale is one of the key ones. So something like the long-term perspective showing up there at number 2. The perspective for these longer-term management plans isn't in the decadal stage, whereas things like political agendas in the UK are 4 years, in Ireland 5 years, in different countries around that 4 or 5 years. So the political scale and the actual required management scale do not match. And that's one of the things put forward as the reasons why ICZM, A, wasn't that popular, and B, wasn't implemented. ICZM was always put across as being a sort of a tree huggers sort of environmental agenda, whereas if you actually read the definition of it, it's about sustainable development, but that seemed to be buried, the fact that it was trying to protect sites. It's not about that at all. It's about realising the potential of a marine environment in a sustainable way. When we move on to the MSFD, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, though it doesn't exclusively mention marine spatial planning directly, it sort of intimates to it and says such as. So this idea that maritime spatial planning should come along. And what seems to have happened now is people seized on the idea that this is a plan. And politicians like plans. They like things that are nice, plan, boxed. And putting boxed, static things in a marine environment isn't a good idea, because the marine environment is not standard. It's fluid, it moves, it changes. It doesn't behave like the terrestrial environment, and it is problematic. So you've got to match this marine spatial planning MSP with all the acronyms that people mentioned earlier, of EIAs, SEAs that Mike talked about this morning, and then try and balance it all together. So working with all these frameworks. We have a definition, or we've had definitions of maritime spatial planning before. There's quite a good one from UNESCO, for example. And again, you get different names, so you get terminologies, MSP, CMSP, OP, zone planning, whatever. And you will be unsurprised to learn that it also has its principles. So again, it is 10, it's got 2 extra for being special, I don't know. So it's got 10 rather than 8. But if you look at the 10 there, and I quickly flick over to the 8, and I'll do this a couple of times, you can see they're very similar, quite a number of things. So the long-term view, the use of legislation, the top-up, bottom-down consultation. So it has the same principles. So in my opinion, it's probably going to have the same problems when it comes to implementation. That's the issue that's going to happen. What people expect to happen in a thing is something like this, a nice example. You end up with a nice, pretty map. So there's your main spatial plan, nice static. If you talk to anyone who's done maritime spatial planning, they'll tell you that's only the start. As soon as you get to there, you've got to go back to start and try and do it again. You've got to go back to the stakeholders and see what they actually want. And the map changes continuously. It's not like a roadmap. It evolves, has to evolve as things change. So if we look back in terms of or look forward into terms of the new proposed European Union MSP and ICZM directive, which was announced in March, this again seems to be sort of taking into account the MSP agenda and the ICM, the integrated management, and put it together. Again, sustainable growth. In a recession, sustainable growth is in every directive. You'll find that, what it's looking at, it talks about to plan, and I have no problem with the idea of to plan, whatever, with sustainable management usage. It obliges member states, so you must carry out MSP and ICZM in accordance with national and international law. But within that as well, then it tends to contradict itself. So it talks about drawing up plans. Drawing up plans is not the same as to plan. It's a different thing, in my opinion. And it talks about integrated coastal management as a tool, which, in my opinion, is wholly wrong. Integrated coastal management is actually a process. It's not a tool at all. MSP is not a tool either. It could be defined as a tool, but it's also a process. So when you put this together, then they've come up with definitions, and there are good things in this proposed directive. So it's identified that we should link the coastal zone to the offshore zone. What had happened before, if you take the Water Framework Directive, it tended to take care of the sort of water quality, good environmental status in our catchment areas out to a prescribed level offshore. Then you have the MSFD picking up that and joining it together, and the coast is sort of, let's ignore the coast. And that's because the coast is a very difficult area to deal with. The vast majority of the population of Europe live on the coast. It's politically sensitive. Lots of our industry sited there. So it's a difficult topic to deal with. So it's good to see that they're putting together. Interestingly, within this terminology, it talks about the limit defined by integrated coastal management strategies. If you take Ireland as an example, Ireland doesn't have an integrated coastal management strategy. Therefore, to define that limit becomes quite problematic. It defines the marine waters, which is fair. You'd expect it to do that. It also identifies sectoral activity, so that they're going to have an impact. Everything you do in the marine environment will have an impact. It can be positive, it can be negative, but we need to be aware that it will have an impact. Within this as well, you have the idea that you have to review the plans every 6 years, as they call it. So again, it's talking about reviewing plans. This is almost a transposition of, I suppose, terrestrial planning into the marine environment. Again, for the integrated strategies. So what you have these two parallel processes with their own, one plans, one is a strategy. And the problem when I put this together is if you look at the actual proposals, you have the marine spatial plans, which is shown on your left. And then if you look at the one for the integrated coastal management strategies, the difference, there isn't really that much difference. And from my perspective, I'm wondering, like, why are you doing the two? Why not do it as an integrated fashion? And I'm obviously biased in this. I think there's a hierarchy here. I think you should have integrated coastal management and then a maritime spatial plan underneath it, or maritime spatial planning. But it shouldn't be a plan per se. It should be a process built into that. We can learn from the lessons of the way that governance has been done in integrated coastal management over the number of years. And governance is one of the worst defined, or most often badly defined terms. Governance is not government, and this is where people get on. Governance is actually the combination of government, economics, the markets, and civil society. And this is what Roger touched on this morning, is that, you know, you can have, if you like, the money, the markets there, you can win over society, and you can not have the political will, the government. So ideally your project should be somewhere in the middle of the triangle in an ideal situation. It's never going to be there. It's how you convince people, how you satisfy those three pillars. And it's very similar. You can overlay, if any of you are into ecosystem approach, it's a very similar thing. You can overlay that on top of that as well. From our experience, and if you look at the process of trying to implement the ICZM, it's been broken down to these sort of 5 stages. This is the work done by Stephen Olson in Rhode Island. And what has tended to happen in ICZM, and this is a lesson to learn for MSP, is the problem usually comes around stage 3.5, 4 into implementation. And historically, the reason for lack of implementation has been political will. It has been, it doesn't just, they don't want to move forward with it, they don't agree with it, or perhaps economic change in economic circumstances. But that's what tends to happen. And I would propose that lots of the problems that have been encountered in implementing ICZM or ICM, whatever you want to call it, over the number of years, will also be encountered by MSP. So there's difficulty there. In terms of the actual governance, the idea of this is that you can do it at different levels, and it can be structured working back right up to global level. But what you're trying to get across is a change in behaviour, how people accept things, and what you get to then is a sustainable use of your environment. And I think the term sustainable use, again, is something people think, oh, that must be a green agenda, and that's not really the case at all. If you look at the definition, it's to actually to drive forward a benefit to all society. And in the case at the minute, this would be sort of getting the energy we need, providing, in this case, under coexist, the aquaculture, the food we're going to need in the future with a growing population. I'll go back and refer back to my marine spatial planning, the nice German example. There was a pilot done in the Irish Sea, and this is from DEFRA, and I apologise, I've seen it before, this has been around for a while. And what they've done here is overlaid all the bits and pieces. And this is what happens if you just throw it together and think of it only being a plan. You end up with this sort of mishmash, and you can barely define the borders. And this is where my liberal arts come in. If I overlay a bit of Jackson Pollock there, you can't really see that much difference between what Pollock was trying to achieve and what's achieved by that underneath. So there is a problem within this. So it's not just a plan. So my view is that marine spatial planning is a process. It needs to be employed as some sort of integrated management approach, and it'll only be implemented or succeed if it bears that in mind. So to conclude, there will be pressure. The pressure will continue. There's going to be an increase in population. A couple of the speakers touched on this morning. This will need more energy, more food, so aquaculture is going to have to increase. We have problems. Another part of the centre that work and looks at ecosystem approaches to fisheries management. We have problems with fisheries, so we're going to have to change over to aquaculture. So we're all going to have to exist in this space. There's going to be conflict. We need to come up with a mechanism to deal with that. There can be synergies, and I think Mike mentioned this morning that under the SFI proposal we're looking at as well, we have aquaculture companies on board because there could be benefits from locating marine renewable energy with aquaculture sites. Aquaculture requires power, they need it for their lights, they need it for feeding systems, for example. They have to use generators usually to do that, and that requires people to go out to them. So we could coexist. The problem for marine renewable energy is it's the new kid on the block, and that is harder to convince, especially if you are the unknown. I think it is the fear of the unknown is the problem. You need input from all relevant stakeholders, and this is very important, and this includes the political will. I said at the start that I used to be an engineer. I used to work in mines. I used to be a mining engineer, and a political decision effectively ended, or a policy decision in the UK finished mining, switched over to gas as the way forward, for valid reasons, but a short-term policy. It was interesting to see this morning the graph showing a longer term that perhaps coal would be a better option. But it's a policy decision that was made to invest in gas generation of electricity rather than clean fuel technology using coal and an indigenous resource rather than importing gas. But that's a political, not bitter. We also need to improve our maritime governance, because we are the customers. We compete for the space. We are the polluters. We're unpredictable, but we're unprepared to accept uncertainty. The unpredictability, I think someone talked about L'Orange this morning, the tide coming in and out, it's very easy to deal with. People go out on a Friday night and don't come back till Sunday. People go out on a Friday night and come back for a week. We're unpredictable things. We're difficult to model. Humans are very difficult. The paradox of uncertainty is very strange to me. I do quite a lot of work on climate change adaptation. People in Ireland are very well prepared to accept that the weather forecast for tomorrow will be wrong. They'll go, oh, sure, it's only the weather forecast, it's only a guide. It rained all day, so it's going to be sunny. But they want me to tell them what the weather's going to be like in 30 years to a millimetre in some cases, what the sea level rise is going to be. So people don't want uncertainty. And I think by having a fixed plan, people think that's certain, and I don't think that's what we need. We need something that's able to adapt and evolve as we move forward. So from this perspective, MSP it's not a static map. It is a dynamic process. And because that, it has to be adaptable. It has to incorporate this change and uncertainty. And the MSFD, for example, acknowledges that there's a role for adaptive management. This needs to be pushed forward. So in answer to my actual question, MSP, it's not wrong. It's part of the solution, but it's not the total solution. And from my opinion, if it's going to succeed, it needs some sort of integrated management and some backing to produce that. Thank you.